Okay, now let's cover the sections 3 and 4 of chapter 11. Section 3, we're going to talk about small populations. And so small populations have their own unique dynamics that can influence the growth or decline of that population. And essentially, changes in growth rate, as it says here, population size and chance events, can have a much bigger impact than on large populations. So in this computer simulation, for example, they looked at three populations in particular and modeled the population over time, but they added in the idea that lambda basically fluctuates randomly, and you can see they start out not quite at zero, but with a really small population. So in any given year, you might have a lambda above 1 or a lambda below 1, and how far above or below is a random function as well. So what can happen is, as you can see, the black dots represent one population that at first started to grow, but then it went through a series of years where lambda was negative and it shrank and it hung on for a little while, but then it essentially went extinct, while the other two populations managed to just kind of hang on at first and then grow and reach a higher level. And so at once, at least with this one, reaching a higher level, it's not as susceptible to extinction because it can handle a few years of limited or negative growth, whereas when you're still relatively small, those few years of negative growth can have an impact on the population, like I said, when it is a small population. And so here's a real-life example from the Channel Islands off of Southern California, and there are these bird populations that live on these islands, and sometimes the populations can get pretty small on a particular island of a given species. And when that happens, essentially the probability of extinction of that population increases a great deal. Whereas you can see when they have really large populations, essentially whether it's 1,000 or 10,000 doesn't matter. That's sort of a large population. You can see the extinction probability is quite low. But when you get down below 10 nesting pairs, essentially that's 20 individuals, that's not so good, and your probability of going extinct is quite high. So chance events can play a role, particularly when we talk about genetics and what's called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a phenomenon that small populations are susceptible to. That is, we usually think of populations and their genes being influenced by natural selection and favoring genes that are good genes and disfavoring genes that aren't so beneficial. Well, when the populations get small, the 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 population's genetic makeup, that is the combinations of genes they have, can drift in relatively random directions that may not have anything to do with selection or survival ability. So, for example, you see in this relatively small population of 10 rabbits, 20% of them are white. Well, if in one year only 5 of them reproduce, and let's say that's random as to who that is, and it just so happens to be only the brown ones, you can see that the population of white ones decreases. They're a recessive, you can see. And so it would take 2 of these guys to produce one of these guys. Um, and if this were to happen several generations, you can see that not necessarily due to selection, but again, just due to uh, random mating in a small population, the one type, the white ones, can basically go extinct. Um, Small populations are also susceptible to inbreeding, um, which is the mating between related individuals, and it has it essentially promotes a decrease in fitness when you have inbreeding, because when closely related individuals are mating, you tend to get more sort of negative or deleterious combinations of genes getting together in offspring. Um, and the example they give here is in Tanzania, in Africa. There are these mountainous areas where there are these old volcanic calderas, and some of these calderas are quite large. You can see the scale here, 20 miles. So this caldera or crater of this ancient volcanic mountain had this or has this populations of lions, and they're relatively isolated from the surrounding areas. Well, one year there was a really bad infestation of these biting flies that had a negative impact on the population. The population shrank. Well, what that did was increase inbreeding because it increased the probability in that small population of related individuals having offspring. So we're talking potentially brothers and sisters and first cousins and stuff like that. It decreased the fertility of the population, and here's the example. Is a sperm cell from one of the males that has two parts on it, two heads, if you will, and so that's going to be a defective cell that's not going to really function. All right, so small populations are also susceptible to what we can call demographic stochasticity, which is essentially uh, random changes in that population due to the small size. Now, we talked about genetic drift is essentially an example of that. And so I want to revisit that here in that let's think about probability for a second. And so we know that if we flip a coin, we have a 50% chance of getting a heads or a tail. Okay. Now, when you flip that coin several times, let's say you flip it 10 times, on average, you should get 5 and 5, 5 heads and 5 tails. But if each of us in the class were to go and do 10 flips, some of us might get 6 and 4, 4 and 6. Some of us might even get 7 and 3. And in some rare cases, some of us might even get 8 and 2, maybe even a 9 and 1. That would be highly unusual, but it's possible. Now, if we each flipped 100 times, we should get, again, approximately 50 and 50, and we might get 49 and 51, 52, 48. But you can probably imagine that the chances of getting 30 and 70 or 20 and 80 is very remote when you do more flips. And so this is analogous to what's going on in small populations and this idea of demographic stochasticity. That is when you have small populations, relatively random changes in things can cause great fluctuations in that population as opposed to a larger population where those random effects have less of an effect on the population and its growth. So up here, if you had a population of 100 rabbits, 20% of them were white, only 50% of them bred. There'd be, and if it was random, there'd be a pretty good chance that at least some of those 50% would be white. Whereas when it's a small population, there's a greater chance that if it's only 50%, those two white rabbits might not be involved with mating. Does that make sense, I hope? All right. Another effect of small population was called the alley effect. Um, and this is somewhat counterintuitive because when we think of it says when growth rate decreases as population density decreases. We've been talking earlier, and we tend to think of when a population is less dense, you tend to get higher growth rates because there's more food and resources for that population. But in some cases, populations can sort of get in a downward, it's my bad interpretation of a spiral, in which as they get smaller, reproductive rates actually decline. And it's not due to a lack of food necessarily or space, but it might be hard to find a mate if the population is too small and the population is spread out across the landscape. Um, and it could be that also as the population gets smaller, as we saw above, you might have a greater chance of finding a mate that is related to you, again leading to inbreeding. So these can all basically promote that downward spiral, which again was known as this alley effect. Changes in the environment random changes can have a negative impact on a population. So for example, here we see some rainfall data. Here's the average, but you can see rainfall can fluctuate between any one year, so that this year there's not much rainfall. And so again, that can have a negative impact on the population. Here it can have a positive impact. Um, so environmental stochasticity, and think of things like natural disasters. Here this happens to just be a satellite image of Hurricane Katrina from 2005. And so if you can imagine, there's a population of something that spans the whole Gulf Coast, it's going to be less impacted than if you happen to be a relatively rare species that's only found right here and you happen to be in the path of this storm. That storm has the potential to essentially knock out your population. All right, last thing, we're going to talk about metapopulations. Metapopulations is a population of populations. Smaller populations that are somewhat isolated from each other. Here's an aerial image of some lakes in northern Alaska, and you can see some are sort of connected here, and some are isolated, some are bigger, some are smaller. And so if you have a species that lives throughout these various islands, and you can think of it's ironic to think of a lake as an island, but essentially a lake is an island in a sea of land, you might say. Um, we can talk about the sources and the sinks. So some of the islands might have better habitat and the populations might be growing there, and they can serve as sources for individuals to migrate to other islands. And some of the metapopulations might be habitats that aren't so good, and they tend to be sinks where they don't really produce so many individuals and disperse them around, but they tend to just take them in, and their growth rates aren't so high. So, of course, within this metapopulation, any of the subpopulations can go extinct at some point in time, but hopefully the whole metapopulation as a whole persists. Um, so here's an equation that sort of looks at that, and it looks at, okay, what is the change in the proportion of habitats that are occupied at some particular point in time? Well, it's a function of the colonization rate, that is what's the rate at which individuals are moving from one patch or one population to another, and what's the extinction rate? How quickly are these little subpopulations going extinct? As with any kind of mathematical model, there's always certain assumptions involved that you can take a look at here. But the take-home message from this is that essentially the ratio of the extinction rate to the colonization rate has to be greater than 1 for the metapopulation to persist, which kind of makes sense, because if extinction of patches is higher than colonization of patches, the metapopulation will go on one of those downward spirals, whereas if colonization rate is greater than the extinction rate, even though one might go extinct, there's a good chance it will be recolonized later in time. And this is not just a hypothetical situation. There is some basis in reality. So here you see a map from northern Norway. What at one time was a fairly contiguous area has now been broken up into separate patches. So now what was one big population has now been broken down into several metapopulations. And it could be any number of things. It could be trees or animals or whatever at this place. Um, and so fragmentation going from here to this direction tends to make this ratio increase, which means there is a greater chance the metapopulation will not survive. And this is called the northern spotted owl, which lives up in the Pacific Northwest United States, and it was studied extensively because there was at one time extensive logging in this area, and these metapopulation analyses showed that at least 20% of the original habitat had to be maintained in order for this metapopulation of these owls to persist. Extinction colonization rates can vary over time, which can affect metapopulation dynamics. And back to our case study, I'm running out of time on my video, but we'll talk about this a little bit in class and see how the introduction of a second species changed the situation in the Black Sea. Okay, that's it.